G'day YouTube, Warbles on a lot here with part 9 of Australia's Day of National Shame, aka book reading of Darwin 1942, Australia's Darkest Hour by Timothy Hall. We're taking up page 67, The Attack on the Aerodrome. Group Captain Frederick Scherger had been a few minutes late leaving the RAAF station to pick up Air Marshal Williams from his hotel. He was halfway there when he heard the anti-aircraft guns burst into life and, looking up, saw a formation of 27 aircraft flying in V formation in 3 groups of 9. Bracket, there were actually 3 such formations, making a second larger V to account for all 81 level bombers from the carriers, close bracket. Instinct or experience told him that the bombers were going to lay down a pattern of bombs that would extend from the wharf up to Larrakia Barracks. And if his instinct was right, it made him perilously close. He hurriedly turned the car around and drove back the way he had come until he reached what he judged to be a relatively safe spot opposite the civil aerodrome. As he turned to look back, the bombs were already falling on the harbour. Then, to his horror, he saw a plume of smoke rising from the RAAF aerodrome, which was now in front of him. He realised that the Japanese were attacking that simultaneously, a possibility that had not occurred to him. He opened the throttle of the staff car and drove as fast as he could back towards the base. Even from that distance of no more than 2 kilometres, he could see clearly that the aerodrome was being dive-bombed and probably machine-gunned, and it occurred to him that if any of the Japanese pilots saw him move, they would probably turn on him as well. 400 metres from the gate, a P-40 suddenly flew across the front of his car with its undercarriage down, the pilot clearly struggling to keep it level. Seconds later, he heard it crash land. Another 100 metres and it was clearly too dangerous to go any further. The dive bombers and Zeros were streaming down, seemingly from every direction, and anything that moved was likely to be shot. He stopped the car and ran for cover under a tree, sharing it with a shocked lorry driver who had been going in the opposite direction. During a lull in the shooting, he thought it safe to drive on, and he had reached the gate into the station when he felt rather than heard a fighter coming in behind him for the kill. Then he heard the crack of the bullets and felt them thud into the mudguard and the boot before throwing himself out of the car and rolling into the long grass. This time he stayed where he was until the raid was over. There was no immediate sign of either the P-40 that had nearly run him down or of its pilot. Of all the unhappy coincidences that occurred that day, few were so ill-timed as the presence in Darwin of a whole squadron of P-40 Kitty Hawks. They were the squadron that should have been there in time to go out with the Timor convoy escorted by Houston and Peary, but they had taken so long getting to Darwin that they did not arrive until the day after the convoy had left. The squadron commander, Major Floyd Pell, had started from Port Pirie in South Australia with 15 aircraft, but for one reason or another that number had dwindled to 10 by the time he got to Darwin. Most of those which failed to complete the journey had broken down, and the 10 which did arrive were in such a state that Pell claimed that he needed 72 hours to make them airworthy. He wanted to begin repairs immediately, but somebody had forgotten to order the maintenance team which would do the work, and another day was lost. On the 17th of February, the squadron was at last ready to fly, a high-altitude patrol with all 10 aircraft, together with an 11th, the solitary P-40 that had been at Darwin when Pell arrived, flown by Lieutenant Robert G. Oestricker. They flew an uneventful patrol over Bathurst and Melville Islands and escorted a 2-ship convoy heading towards the northern Australian coast. On the 18th of February, Houston's convoy had been attacked and ordered back to Darwin, and an extraordinary decision was taken that the P-40s were to leave for Java. It was extraordinary for 2 reasons. It would leave Darwin without any air cover when the return of the convoy could only mean an imminent attack by the Japanese, and the Japanese were giving Java such a hammering at that very moment that there was almost no chance of the P-40s being able to land there, even if they arrived without being shot down by the vastly superior Zeros. It was an irresponsible decision that may perhaps have been influenced by a reluctance on the part of the Americans to see their aircraft involved in a major battle with the Japanese if they stayed in Darwin. Although the aircraft were within the territory of the Northwest Area Commander, He had no authority to tell the American squadron what to do. Even if an attacking force was known to be on the way, he could not send up the P-40s to try to repel it. Pell, however, had no choice about the decision. Any relation to Cardinal Pell, one wonders. Had no choice about the decision to send him to Java. And he prepared to take off at dawn the following morning, the 19th. When the time came, however, he found that his aircraft had mechanical trouble and that the coolant was leaking. So 2 hours were wasted while the engineers tried unsuccessfully to repair it. In the end, Pell took another aircraft and ordered its pilot to fly the faulty plane to Brisbane where the repairs could be done properly. They took off at 9:15. Pell had not been sure of the way to Java, and a B-17 bomber was accompanying them to give them a navigational aid. But minutes before they had taken off, they had lost contact with Kopang in Timor, which meant they would have to fly the first leg of the journey without any ground assistance. At 9:30, minutes before the first report of the approaching Japanese was received by Darwin radio, the United States Air Force Operations Officer at Darwin advised Pell that the weather was closing in ahead of them. If he had had experienced pilots, Pell might have continued, but with the exception of Ostrika, they were young, unskilled and only half-trained. They had never seen a shot fired in anger and had no experience of aerial combat. They did not even know how to fly in bad weather, and Pell immediately turned back for Darwin. They were back over the town at about 9:55, but there was no warning that the Japanese were almost on top of them because the Australians had not bothered to pass on the signal to the Americans' operation room. Pell ordered Ostrika to take his flight, which consisted of Ostrika himself and 4 other pilots, up to 5,000 metres and to stay there on patrol for 2 hours. He then took his own flight leisurely down to an easy landing. The raid was 1 minute away. It was Ostrika who spotted the Japanese first. At 2,600 metres, he glanced over his shoulder when something suddenly caught his attention and saw a fighter diving straight at him. Even if he had not seen the rising sun on the fuselage and wings, he would have known at once from the profile that it was a Zero. In the same breath, he shouted a warning, quote, 000, unquote, into his radio and banked sharply to escape the fighter's guns. Not one of his flight answered him as he told them to make for the safety of the cloud 6 kilometres to the south of town. To his left he could see Lieutenant Jack Perez, already dead in his P-40, which was rolling slowly over as it plunged towards the sea. Lieutenant Elton Perry was also dead. Of the other two, Lieutenant Max Weeks was still alive, but his radio had been broken. Lieutenant William Walker had been shot in the shoulder and he was trying to land his badly damaged aircraft with one hand. As he came head high over the Stewart Highway, he was vaguely aware that he had almost collided with an RAAF staff car, but he had more pressing problems on his mind. He landed badly, but without doing himself further injury. He pulled himself out of the cockpit as fast as he could, knowing that he had only seconds before the inevitable Zero came to finish him off. He leaped from the aircraft and threw himself into cover as the Zero roared in, strafing the Kitty Hawk from end to end. Within minutes it had burned to a cinder. Weeks survived by parachuting over the sea after his plane had been riddled with bullets. He landed in the sea 16 kilometres from land. All through the day he swam and rested, carried in and out by the fearsome tide which raises and lowers the water in Darwin Harbour by more than 6.5 metres, and knowing that the waters around him were alive with shark and jellyfish. Eventually he was carried to the shore and strapped himself to a tree to prevent himself being washed back into the sea. When he had rested, he made his way to hospital. Ostrika himself stayed in the air until the raid was over, hiding in cloud as well as he could. At 5,000 metres, he came across 2 dive bombers and intercepted them both, shooting them down to claim the first Allied aerial victories over Australia. He had not, in fact, had much more experience than the other pilots, but he was a naturally good pilot and, above all, he had the advantage of height over the bombers, and this gave him superiority in the dogfight. He later landed safely. Pell, meanwhile, had landed without incident and was standing in the shade of his wing when he heard Ostrika's frantic call that he was being attacked. The only wise action for Pell and his flight to have taken at that moment was to dive into the nearest cover, but they didn't. With his 4 young and inexperienced pilots following his example and tagging along behind him, he began to taxi out for takeoff. An officer with more experience would have known that their chances of getting into the air safely and then surviving were somewhat worse than nil. A flight of Zeros saw what was happening and tore across the field towards them, their machine guns churning up the grass and ripping through the aircraft's skin. Pell just managed to get airborne before his plane exploded in flames. He ejected? No such animal. He bailed out. He jumped out. They didn't have ejection seats in 1942. But the chute had not even opened when he hit the ground. For a moment he seemed to be trying to drag himself to cover, but he had hardly moved when a Zero pilot swooped on him and gunned him to death. A second pilot died immediately, but 2 others, Lieutenants Bert Rice and John Glover, managed to climb to 1,600 metres before Rice's controls were shot away and his aircraft began to spin crazily back to Earth. Rice bailed out but hit his head as he went out of the cockpit and was knocked unconscious. The parachute opened properly, but Rice was hanging from it like a puppet and the Zeros were closing in like sharks. With great courage, Glover, who had seen his plight, flew straight at the Zeros to try to break them up and distract them, but his own plane was now mortally damaged and he went down in a steep dive. As it threatened to shake itself to pieces, Glover struggled helplessly with the controls. Then at the very last moment, it levelled out and hit the aerodrome, somersaulting over and over and breaking into tiny fragments with a dreadful tearing noise of metal. Somehow Glover was still conscious and, dragging himself clear, he wandered off down the side of the aerodrome. He would still have died if an Australian, sheltering in a slit trench, had not rushed out and dragged him to safety, cheating the Zero by seconds as it roared in to finish him off. His action in the seconds before he went into that last dive had given Rice the precious moments that he needed to reach the ground. He landed in a swamp and the water brought him back to his consciousness. He too made his way back to base. The bravery of the American pilots cannot be challenged. All of them were awarded the American Distinguished Service Cross. But in aerial dogfights, bravery is seldom enough to defeat experience. And most of the Japanese dive bomber and Zero pilots were very experienced, many of them veterans of Pearl Harbor. They attacked the aerodrome with explosive and incendiary bullets, diving repeatedly till they almost touched the ground before pulling up in a steep zoom, turning at the top of the zoom and diving again to attack. The Zero itself was a far more manoeuvrable aircraft than the P-40, although it was not quite so fast in level flight. And in a dogfight, unless it was surprised like the 2 Zeros which were destroyed by Ostrika, it always had... No, he destroyed dive bombers, they said, not Zeros. It always had the advantage because it could climb higher than the P-40. Air Commodore Douglas Wilson, the Northwest Area Commander, said that he would never deliberately dogfight with a Zero if he was in a P-40. Quote, "We would use our extra speed to get away. Dive and zoom. Dive, shoot, keep going. We would never stick around because we would always lose." The dive bombers carried their own bombs and then came back to attack with their machine guns, but some of their pilots also carried small anti-personnel bombs that weighed only about 500 grams. They were 20 centimetres long and shaped like a miniature conventional bomb, but they were specifically designed for use against troops when the pilot was too far past them to employ his machine gun. As he flew over, he would drop the bomb over the side of the aircraft by hand, and if it landed in a crowd, it could do terrible damage. Wink, wink, wink. Many of the conventional bombs that they dropped were also anti-personnel devices known as daisy cutters, which exploded and then hurled their shrapnel only a few centimetres above ground level. That's what did the damage. And against the ships they experimented with a single parachute incendiary bomb which landed slowly enough to ensure that it did not go straight through the deck but set fire to the superstructure and the bridge. The anti-aircraft guns fired continuously at the Japanese during the raid, and the gunners were widely praised for their courage, but that does not detract from the fact that their inexperience resulted in their fire causing the Japanese very little trouble. The commander of the anti-aircraft defences was Lieutenant Colonel John Young, who described as misjudgment the fact that all through the raid the guns were firing about 100 metres too low. He believed that the fault was in the sighting coupled with the excitement of their first raid. Whatever the reason, Young conceded afterwards that his gunners had not come up to the high standard expected of them, and Fuchida himself said that the guns had never seriously troubled the Japanese. Here endeth this chapter.